I think there's going to be quite a lot about levelling up. I think also there'll probably be quite an emphasis on climate change, for better or for worse. And I would be very surprised indeed if we didn't hear quite a lot about the NHS. Now, again, there's an enormous difference between just uttering platitudes and actually getting to grips with a problem that's been with us now for decades. So I think we hear all these things. You asked me what levelling up means. I think we've accepted for a long time in this country, and perhaps too readily accepted, that there are two nations. And that what we need to do is to make sure that opportunity for all is equal. Now, one of the things that means quite inevitably is education, getting rigour into our education system, as opposed to grade inflation, as opposed to the shrug when we're dealing with difficult children. And that is going to be one of the biggest tests. And yet we don't hear as much about that as we hear about some of the other aspects. But Boris made a very good point there about wages. We've accepted for years that some wages are very, very low. And OK, if our people won't do it, well, so what? We'll bring in immigrants to do it. And he's saying an end.
And that's an interesting point that you make there. He's talking about seeing wage inflation, but and I think Kwasi Kwarteng just a couple of days ago was talking about how we're witnessing the economy going through transition from low wage to high wage economy, and that there's going to be this period of bumps in the road. But ultimately, those costs are just going to be passed on to consumers, aren't they? And I don't know if I accept that this argument of wage inflation is going to result in levelling up. It could, especially when, and I'll just bring in this headline. We've got The Observer talking about levelling up by raising taxes on the poor. We're also seeing benefits being cut. I don't know that we're going to see people being in a more level playing field after, say, 5-10 years of this government.
First of all, we're not seeing benefits being cut at all. Don't say that. What we're actually seeing is a temporary uplift that was announced to cope with COVID being removed in the same way that furloughs being removed. That's not exactly the same
taxes being
thing.
increased, national insurance, which will disproportionately affect the working.
I'm trying to deal with benefit at the moment. You mentioned several things. Can't deal with them simultaneously. So we are not, or the government is not, cutting benefits. Now, when it comes to taxes, I am not sympathetic to the big rises that we've seen, because I think that if you really want to stimulate growth in the economy, you lower taxes, you don't actually raise them, and there's plenty of data to support that. So, but you make a very important point right at the beginning when you talked about inflation, and that is a concern. It is what we call cost push, when the cost of wages will push the prices up, and then you get inflation. But the government is well aware of that, and the Bank of England is as well aware of that as you and I are, and we'll be interested to see what Boris has to say about countering that.
But it's interesting the point you make. I mean, you are not in the minority of people who are concerned, Conservatives who are concerned about the perhaps unconservative proposals that are being put forward by this particular government. And there's a difficult line for the Prime Minister to walk, isn't there, between trying to keep his own party happy, trying to keep those red wall voters that famously lent him their vote at the last election, that gave him that majority, and doing that at the same time as raising taxes.
Yeah, well, I have a message for the Prime Minister, and instead of sort of looking at who you're going to please, look at what is the right thing to do. And that is a very, very good principle of government, and we forget it. And indeed, you know, we're falling into the trap now. We're talking about how things might be perceived, whereas, in fact, the most important thing is what is the right thing to do and why. Is that the right thing to do? And that's what I want to hear from every single Secretary of State this week. What and why?
Can't deny that this conference is taking place and the UK is in a time of crisis. We've got petrol forecourts, especially in London and the southeast. They're running dry. We've got supermarket shelves that are empty. We've got food rotting in the fields. All of this, meanwhile, whilst Conservative MPs are up in Manchester. SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford has called on Mr Johnson to start with an apology to the millions of families who'll be poorer and worse off as a result of Tory salary cuts. And Sir Keir Starmer, in relation to the crisis that the country's in right now, has called for Parliament to be recalled to deal with the crisis. My question to you is, how is Boris Johnson going to use his speech on Wednesday to try and persuade people that he's in control amongst all of this that's going on in the background?
Well, don't forget that all of this that's going on in the background is very largely due to COVID and to the measures that were taken. For example, take your empty supermarket shelves and the fuel crisis, very largely down to, not entirely, but very largely down to shortage of truck drivers. And yet we came out of COVID with 47,000 HGV tests piled up, not having taken place. I would like to know what on earth the government was doing. While those tests were piling up, they must have seen what was coming. But it's a consequence of COVID, and we do have to accept, not just us, our problem is we're quite insular when it comes to news. If you actually look right across Europe, you've got enormous problems. You've got truck driver shortages. You've got these problems. And as for the fuel prices, the Prime Minister was right. This was largely driven by demand, by people panicking at the pumps and creating the very situation they were trying to avoid.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.